name is Karen Patterson, and I am the curator at the Fabric Workshop and Museum. And I'm so pleased that we could all get together after the year that we've had, almost on a full year now. We can talk about the idea of empathy, and we can talk about the idea of empathy as grounded in the creative process and in the collaborative process, which are two things that the Fabric Workshop and Museum are so known for. So with that, I'd love to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to walk through and ground our conversation with the actual exhibition. And then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, a little bit of a demo, and then we'll leave some space at the end of the talk for your own questions as they relate to the show and the complicated ideas of empathy. So first, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Samara Golden is our Fabric Workshop and Museum artist in residence. She's Los Angeles based, and upstairs at Steve's, her exhibition and the result of a residency is on view until February 21st of this year. So we do hope that you get to see it. Her work has also been featured in many solo exhibitions at MoMA PS1, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, Night Gallery in Los Angeles, Canada in New York, and her work is in the permanent collection of the Whitney Museum in New York, LACMA and MoCA in Los Angeles, as well as a used museum in Shanghai. Also joining us is New York Times bestselling author Leslie Jamison, who is the author of Empathy Exams, The Recovering, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, The Gin Closet. She is a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, and her work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Atlantic, Harper's, and the Virginia Quarterly Review. She currently lives in Brooklyn with her daughter and teaches at Columbia University. So we're so pleased to have this many vantage points as we talk about the exhibition, and we can talk about a little bit about the year that went into making this exhibition and this project happen. So to start us off, I'd like to introduce our Director of Education, Christina Roberts, who will walk us through the exhibition. Samara, would you like to tell us a little bit about what we're experiencing here?
Yeah, so you're walking from the elevator in the back of the space up to the piece. But the funny thing is it's night there right now, which I forgot about being on the West Coast. So you're going to see the piece sort of different than normal. But so you're coming up to the railing, and then what you see is this expanse with a building. But in actuality, what this is like a V-shaped mirror that then goes from the viewing platform all the way to this window that I really wanted to use when I first heard that these windows exist, because they were covered up at the time. So anyway, what you're seeing is kind of like this building made from the reflections. And I call that a lighthouse. And usually it has stained glass, but you can't see it because it's night. And then it's sort of a scene of like post-hurricane maybe, or post-disaster with, there's the sand dunes. Oh, I guess we're looking at the ceiling. The sand dunes are on the ceiling, and then you are not really supposed to necessarily look up there from the viewing platform, but down below what you see is all these basically just a disaster scene, sort of. But maybe the pictures I think that we'll look at later will show this better, because I myself haven't even seen it at night. And so I think that's the physical layout of the piece. I just wanted to explain what it literally was, so that you can understand that when you were walking up to it, it was just a small bit of real estate inside of the gallery, but it then becomes this bigger, larger, kind of impossible space that doesn't really exist. Okay.
Well, and thank you, Christina, and thank you, Samara, for giving us that introduction. I think I want to start, Samara, if I can, just by asking you, what is this piece about for you? And in light of the year that we went through, how has it changed? And we have some images to help us out here, but those are the big questions I think everyone's wanting to know. What was it about, and how did it change?
Okay, well, I guess, well, to begin with, um, before everything was really started, I feel like the piece was sort of about this feeling of impending doom that I was having, and kind of like the loss of my brother-in-law to ALS and all the pain that was involved with that because it's such a brutal disease. And then he died right before I went to actually make the piece on site with everybody. And so I was like in this sort of raw state, just getting there. And then also part of that was just sort of my feeling about general unrest in the world and 4 years of Trump. And you guys can imagine all the unraveling of all that. So initially, I was in a residency in Sweden like previous months and had kind of been feeling like I needed to retreat or withdraw from the world and that I just wanted to camp and be outside of society and kind of, I just couldn't deal with everything. And so initially we started making a rock that could be the viewpoint for the piece because I just wanted to create it as a place to as a place to think, I guess. And I had found an amazing place in Sweden that was like this, and I realized that I really needed that and needed to be around nature. So then moving on, I Abby came out, which you weren't introduced to Abby, but she was the or is the studio master at the fabric workshop. And so she came out to Los Angeles and we built a model of the space on the eighth floor. And we worked with mirrors and stuff to try to figure out what the piece was going to be. And I knew I wanted to use that window at the end. So then suddenly, like through playing around with it, we were able to make that structure at the end, which I'm calling a lighthouse. And then the ceiling beams sort of became the like structure for a deck that had been ripped off or wasn't around, and then there was sand dunes and all that stuff. So anyway, but to sort of back up, the this kind of disaster was sort of a metaphor for the way I felt more than being a depiction of a disaster. And it was also maybe a metaphor for like the state of the world at that time. That's how I was thinking of it, um, like what humans are doing to the earth, etc.
So
So
you
then,
went from, so
let's
you went from this idea of escaping to this idea of just ruin and disaster. And how was that process for you? What was the transition from going from the need to retreat to the need to kind of show catastrophe?
um, that's a good question.
Well, I think for me, what I noticed with you is that you're so personal and so intimately involved in your process. And so this was something that was very personal that was happening to you. And you were trying to show how impossible that feeling is for a lot of people. Is that right?
um, yeah, I I think so. I think all of the work that I've done, it's it's really about creating a thought or a place that doesn't exist and making it and like trying to materialize it into a scene or thing that then becomes an impossible space that doesn't exist on Earth. And so um, basically, I think that there's a lot of pain was going into the piece initially, and I didn't know there were so many components. I can't go into all of them now, but that's what I thought the piece was. And then what happened was, I think to address the first part of your question, was that then the pandemic came and um, it was like everybody's reality. Everybody had uh, someone who died, or everyone was in this horrible situation, and so it became, yeah, I don't know.
I think that's a really important way to start the conversation and talking about how things change, because I really want to now talk to Leslie about the idea of disruption and especially as it relates to empathy. You had some really wonderful observations, and I wanted to also start with a quote from Empathy Exams that help us a little bit understand what empathy is and maybe it's not for a lot of people. So I'll start with that quote, and then I'd love to ask you the role of vantage point, because it was really important to Samara that you see and experience the installation from a certain place. And then, of course, the idea of disruption, that this started out as something, and because the world took over in this way, it became something else. And how does empathy show up for that? So I'll just start with your quote. Empathy isn't just something that happens to us, a meteor shower of synapses firing across the brain. It's a choice we make to pay attention, to extend ourselves. It suggests that you enter into another person's pain as you'd enter another country through immigration and customs, border crossings by way of queries. What grows where you are? What are the laws? What animals grace here? And so that speaks to me about boundaries and borders, and maybe that's where empathy shows up. So could you share a little bit about the role of disruption and boundaries and empathy? And welcome.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for that question, Karen, and the invitation to be part of this conversation. And thank you, Samara, for creating this beautiful and provocative and painful piece. It's really a pleasure to be talking to you about it today. And I think, that quote in a way feels like such a perfect way to start, because what you were saying just a few moments ago, Samara, about this landscape that you've made here as a landscape of wreckage and disaster, but more than it was trying to portray an actual disaster, it was portraying an interior state of feeling. I think that's part of what I was trying to capture in that formulation of empathy as traveling into another country or traveling into another landscape. It's almost like, what if you could imagine the state of other people's feelings as a kind of a world and live in it and just notice things about it rather than reducing it to a single word or a single category. There's something about living in a landscape that allows for complexity and multiplicity. And the first time I experienced this installation, which was digitally, as we're all experiencing it today, I felt so aware of kind of, even though I was experiencing it digitally, I felt immersed in what it was conjuring, and was thinking about the ways in which the kinds of disruptions that brought me to that moment, or have brought all of us tonight to this moment of experiencing this installation digitally, like they aren't obstructing us from the experience of the exhibit. Like, this is the experience of the exhibit, to be, both collaborative in the sense that, like, we are tracking the camera work of somebody who's taken us to this place, like to be experiencing it through a screen, to be even within the context of the exhibit, like seeing something reflected through mirrors, seeing these sand dunes on the ceiling, but seeing them as if they are a kind of landscape that we're perched above. Like, all of those aspects of mediation and partial access, and that we're not actually there, we're kind of imagining our way there. To me, that makes it a much more accurate portrayal of what empathy is, because, like, in wrestling with empathy and kind of getting more and more confused about empathy, hopefully generatively or productively confused over the years, I guess I feel like there's something so ethically important about understanding that we only ever have partial and mediated access to the landscapes of other people's interiors. Like, when we see this, that something has happened here, that there's been some kind of disaster, some sort of wreckage, like, we don't have the full coherent story. Like, we're piecing together these things that we see, we're piecing together even an imagining of what it would be like to be in that space. And that's actually, to me, this like kind of beautifully profound evocation of how empathy works. Like, we are getting little bits and pieces of a story that we might not ever fully know, and we're kind of trying to summon ourselves into that experience rather than being able to inhabit it totally. So I think, to me, all the ways in which our access is happening on these kind of uncertain and provisional and disrupted terms, like, those are actually, in this gritty way, like really beautiful kind of evocations of the grit that is always involved in empathy. And one thing I wasn't thinking about before, but just listening to you, Samara, tonight talk about how important it was to you to use this window that had been covered up. I was thinking about that in relation to empathy too, how part of what empathy is maybe is finding these windows that have been covered up because, you know, whatever, there are things that are hard to speak about, or things that are too painful to speak about, or kinds of pain that we've forgotten, or ways we can't find language for all the things we feel inside. And like, part of what we might do as human beings for each other is to like find those windows that have been covered and like try to kind of uncover them and peer through them. And this installation has done some of that work in this really stunning way.
Wow, that's so articulate. So amazing. I feel, yeah, thank you. I think all of that thinking is in the piece, and that was great that you were able to say it. Yeah, sorry.
And I want to pick up on the idea of entering someone's landscape and introduce my colleague at the Fabric Workshop and Museum, Abby Lutz, who is the senior project coordinator at the museum, and also was the lead studio manager for Samara's project. And Abby, I just would like to start with reading a quote that's in the catalog that articulates exactly what it's like to, you know, cross borders into someone else's way of thinking, because that is so much about, this is a great image to use while I read that quote, actually. Collaborating with Samara was different for us because she is such a very insular artist. Our main challenge was just cracking that Samara code. The way she thinks is almost like a spider web, in which she is thinking about various things at once. In some ways, at some points, you think you have it, but then the puzzle pieces come together in a completely different way. So it felt like we were trying to make the right shape pieces, and we wouldn't know if they were right until they connected to another piece to create the whole. And so that brings me back to the idea of empathy and experimentation, that you didn't know where you were heading all the time, and that you really had access to all these materials and objects as a way of kind of communicating, as Leslie said, beyond words. So could you talk a little bit about your experience and the idea of the role of empathy and collaboration and experimentation?
Yes. Yeah, this was one of the most unique projects we've done, and working with Samara was probably, to use the word empathy, really forced us to get into Samara's brain and see how she thinks and really trust that process. And when I say trust, like, we were going down these experimental tunnels and these pathways, not knowing entirely where they were headed, but it was really, on my part, it was really magical and really fun to see those all come together and really try to like look through Samara's eyes and understand what she was thinking. And you know, materials were such a big part of it too. I don't know, we, you know, when we sourced our materials, a lot of times we would go to thrift stores, and we would find objects that had a previous life. And so already like embedded in those objects was a history and a story, but yet Samara taught us like this beautiful way of just subtly changing these objects, either just slightly changing the scale, adding a little trim. I have like an example of a boot that she showed us how if you just cut the boot slightly and slice out a small portion of it and put it back together, that proportion took you to another place. You know, it became the right proportion within the exhibition. And I found that was really a magical moment, because when you looked at it in the mirror, you started to relate to that object, not how you normally relate to it in everyday life. You know, your scale to that object. As soon as it became that half-size object and then reflected in the mirror, it really became another dimension and another. It took on its own new life, which was really cool.
That's a great segue to the role of the mirrors. And Samara talks so eloquently about what the mirrors do in terms of our perception of a space. So, and then Leslie, I know there's some really great correlations to the idea of reflection, but also just mirrors in general when it comes to empathy. So I'd love to start with you, Samara, about like, what do mirrors feature prominently in most of your installations, and they serve a really important role in this particular installation. Can you talk a little bit about why mirrors and what they do for your intent?
Yeah. Well, I think that I really like the idea of using them as a tool, not a trick, and trying to, I guess what I would ultimately like to make is something that can't be made kind of in this world with the physical limitations that we all have. So I think the mirrors are a way of expanding space oftentimes and making a kind of like, I guess I'm interested in the idea of a place that doesn't or can't really exist in real life at all, but you feel like is there. Just sort of like I guess, a gateway to a different dimension, or what it's like to be dreaming, or something that's parallel with reality and is reality, because it does actually exist. It's not all tricks, but that it expands your ideas, and it yeah, I don't know, I'm you guys are so much more articulate than I am about everything. It's like kind of amazing. I'm still like stuck in my mind sort of about this piece. I was telling Abby the other day that I think I won't really be able to kind of articulately talk about all the things it's meant to me until it's down and until I get a little perspective on this time period. Yeah.
Well, it's worth noting to everybody here that you haven't seen it, and that's so unusual and so devastating for everyone, but mostly you in that way, that this was such a personal and everything, in my opinion, every step that you took was a reflection of what was going on in your mind and in your heart, whether you're walking from the museum to your home and you see something that kind of devastates you, or you're grappling with the death of your brother-in-law, or you're really watching the kind of world crumble around you. And every day you would bring that to Abby in the studio and say like, oh God, what now? And how do we do this? And then for you to be, at March, when we were 2 weeks away for sharing that journey with the world, you had to go back to LA. And so I just want to reiterate that is the utmost disruptive experience. And,
Well,
so,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say, like, the last thing that happens in these pieces is that the last bit of mirrors go in. So I just wanted to make that clear. Like, I never got to see the last puzzle piece put together, so the whole space is formed, even though I fully can imagine what it feels like and everything, the experience of it. So I haven't felt, which has been really heartbreaking for sure.
yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Well, I do want to stay on the mirrors a little bit and move it on to this metaphorical idea of reflection, and maybe even just physical mirrors for you, Leslie. I'm posing this question of like, what does reflection, how does it show up in empathy? And it may be obvious, but I think you might parse it apart a bit differently than we would expect.
Yeah, there's so much to say there, and so many ways that I think Samara's installation has helped me think about maybe reflection and seeing and access in relation to empathy a little bit differently. But I also just wanted to say, and I will speak about those things, but I just wanted to say that I it's so moving to me and sort of painful to, well, simultaneously maybe painful and inspiring to just sort of think about the story of the installation, both, what Abby and Samara were describing around different sort of chapters and different attempts that where maybe there hit some kind of block, but some element of the emotionality or materiality of those attempts sort of like showed up in different ways in the final installation. But then just these disruptions, and ultimately, what Samara was just saying around the pain of not being able to experience the thing. To me, it's so powerful to be experiencing the installation, not trying to kind of forget about that loss, but to just know that the installation also kind of holds it in the way that, you know, as Samara was describing, you know, really honestly and articulately earlier, like it also holds this, you know, this other loss and this other grief. So to me, it's like a space that where the bodies that aren't there are pretty present in their absence, and that's actually a really meaningful way art can work. And I think, you know, I was a couple times tonight, I've also been really struck by Samara, your articulation of like trying to create an impossible space or trying to create impossible things that the world can't hold, because in a way, like I think sometimes we forget that about empathy because it's a word that we use a lot and pretty easily and sort of toss around. But when I think about like what empathy actually is, it is, when we say empathy, if what we mean is somehow understanding totally or inhabiting another person's state of mind or feeling, that is an impossibility, because we never actually have that access to our understanding of other people, and things can get really toxic if we pretend or sort of misunderstand things to believe that we do. And so that idea of kind of creating an impossible thing or reaching towards the impossible thing actually feels to me like a kind of pretty ethical humility when it comes to thinking about just like human relationship, and to not insist upon the total, but to sort of acknowledge that actually when we talk about knowing each other, in some ways we are summoning like an impossible crossing of dimensions. And maybe that idea of the mirrors comes into play with that crossing of dimensions too, because to me, you know, when I first saw this installation and then sort of came to understand that what I thought was on the floor was on the ceiling, and that it was actually a reflection, it didn't feel to me at all like, you know, when Samara, when you were saying you want the mirrors to feel like a tool, not a trick, like it felt actually like a beautiful kind of destabilization rather than a like, haha, they're actually on the ceiling. It was more like, you know, this questioning of like, when we see things, what are the different ways in which certainty is taken from us, or like stability is taken from us, and then what happens, or how can we see differently, or how can we kind of come alive when that certainty is taken from us, which I think comes back to disruption. How can disruption, or sort of the ground beneath our feet, or the thing we thought was up was down, like all these ways the world sort of turns on us, they're actually just kind of invitations to let our nerve endings be awake in a different way, in the way that they kind of go to sleep when we feel like we're on certain ground. My mom was then.
Thank you. I'm speechless. Like, yeah, that's amazing to me that you can experience it digitally and then also be able to have all those thoughts, and then also, because to me it's so distant from the actual piece, and then also that you can listen to what I just said, which I don't even know what I said, and kind of like really understand it. Like, I think this, for me, I just have to say, for me, this world of Zoom is very, I just feel like I'm a head that's like put in another place. Like when you were looking at the installation, I feel like we're all just disconnected heads heading toward, like floating towards the installation, looking at it. It's very disembodying or something, the whole experience. And I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of my work I want to make in the future. But yeah, I just feel it's amazing to be able to be present in this kind of a format. Anyway, we can go
Abby,
on.
what did it feel like to finish this without Samara, to complete this installation, to add that final piece of the puzzle, which is one of the most integral pieces as we're learning, which is the mirrors? How did that feel like from the studio perspective?
I mean, it was kind of heartbreaking not having Samara there with us to kind of have the reveal, but we just communicated really closely, and I sent you tons and tons of pictures, and I used that mirror on the floor, and we FaceTimed, but it was, I mean, it was in the height of kind of things just opening up and things being very strange. So everything was just awkward. I mean, it was just, and we all just were surviving in a certain way mentally. but yeah, it was difficult. It was interesting. I can't say much more.
Well, I want to ask both you and Samara, because I know that in your quote you referenced Samara's practice as insular, and I agree with that. It's also very intuitive. And one of the aspects of the collaboration with the Fabric Workshop and Museum is that it is about a dialogue, and you really had to get into Samara's mind, as you said. So I want to talk about intuition and empathy. Like, what were you willing to share, Samara? What was hard to share? How do you get people into your intuitive side? And then in the same way, I feel like Abby, you had to meet her where she was, like wherever she was. What did you have to make up for? What did you have to pull back from? Because I think collaboration is also a word that gets thrown around a lot, at like empathy, and you're like, oh yeah, it's just like everyone's working together, and it's not that. It's so much more than that, and so much more complex. And it also feels like walking into someone else's space and not knowing if you should be there, and all those things. And so I guess I wanted to ask you both, um, the relationship between intuition and collaboration. If that's a broad question, I can be more specific, but let me know if that's good.
Should I start, Abby?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I have to say that I think that I had sort of like given up on my ability to collaborate with other people right at the same moment that Abby came on as a project manager, or whatever the title is. And pretty much instantly I felt like it was like so great. Like I could just be open about everything, and it was not related to the product of making the piece, but more about the process of like, what are we going to do? How do we feel? Or like, and so she went through the roller coaster of everything. Like I owe her a lot. And also just like, she's probably experienced what I'm like as a person in a really deep way. And it must be frustrating sometimes because yeah, I had so many different ideas and so many different things tested out that we didn't end up using, but it's wonderful for me because I can have that knowledge and use it again in another experience. But for me, that was sort of like what made it possible to really make this piece. But then there were a lot of decisions like towards the end that we really had to be businesslike in figuring out how to just make a decision. And one thing to be said too is that Karen, you weren't there at the beginning either. So it's like, and also Christina, the new executive director, like everything changed all at the same time. So it was all just like a lot of changes, and especially for someone who I had determined I wasn't good at working with people before this. So, but I think I'm missing part of the question, but Abby, do you want to address some of it and then I can go back?
Well, yeah, and I on my part, just one of the things that we did was in translating, kind of, I guess, transcribing or understanding each other's way of understanding materiality and like how the materials we were working with work, you know. So we had like different interpretations, and I think that's one reason our collaboration. I will say, you know, we're friends, and I love Samara, and I love the way she thinks about things, and just I had to learn how you solve things, and that was really fun. It's almost, and I hope this doesn't offend you, but it was almost childlike how you saw things in reflections and created these magical worlds. And I think you told me a story once about your father and creating these scenarios and these scenes. But anyways, back to like materiality and you know, I would come with my ideas of what this thing could be and how it could work for the piece, and you would come, and together, like we might have two different interpretations, but it made that object even that process even more interesting. And that's when collaboration, I think, really works, is when, you know, both people bring to the piece, and then it becomes just that much more dynamic and interesting.
Leslie, I'm curious your
Yeah.
thoughts. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Samara.
So I was just going to quickly put it in there that about the idea of reflection. For me, it was important and kind of amazing to have Abby's really articulate too, and so she's able to idea to me, and that was a really helpful process. And that isn't what I thought of. I didn't think of collaboration in that way exactly before. But anyway, Leslie.
I was just going to pose a really tough question for Leslie, but maybe this is for everyone too, is collaboration empathetic? And I guess, and is empathy, is collaboration required to be empathetic? I guess, do you know what I mean? Like, it's in hearing Abby and Samara talk, I feel like there's a simpatico that happened by sharing material things, but I'm wondering what you think are, what's required to be empathetic, and is collaboration one of those things? Is that a tough question?
I think it's a great question. I mean, and I, yeah, I mean, I think the dialogue that just happened between Samara and Abby is like a really beautiful launching off point for that question too, because I you know, I think I experience so many things in life, certainly friendship or cultivating like a world inside a classroom as versions of what Samara and Abby were both speaking to, where it's like kind of posing that question, like what's possible when these two minds come together, or these two ways of being, or these two ways of working with materials, or these two ways of speaking that wouldn't have been possible for either one of them on their own. And you know, it's funny because part of how I came to the fabric workshop and museum is my dear friend Katie, who, as you guys know, is part of the team there, and that is actually one of those friendships where I feel like these one of the graces of that friendship feels like, how does Katie see the world in a completely different way than I do, and allow me to see things in a way that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So I think in that way there is this deep connection between collaboration and empathy, because part of, in kind of both directions, part of what it means to empathize with another person, whatever sort of tricky, unstable state of communion we're summoning when we use the word empathy, is it involves both parties, right? It involves one party listening and speculating and imagining, but it can't just be this one-sided set of speculations or assumptions or projections. Like, I think ideally when empathy is happening right, it's not just like one person is an object that is being empathized with and the empathizer is sitting there assuming, you know, what the other person thinks or feels. It's like more of a response, kind of call and response, like an asking of questions, a listening to replies. Like part of the context in which I was thinking about empathy when I was writing about it was work that I did in Iowa City as a medical actor, where I was essentially paid to have to act as if I had different sorts of disorders or medical problems, everything from like appendicitis to you know, a kind of conversion disorder from grief. And I think, and then medical students would sort of try to figure out what was wrong with me, and that, in that job, it felt like, oh, empathy has to be collaborative. Like there has to be this kind of, these acts of listening and responding to what's coming from the other person, rather than just moving fully in one direction. And I think, you know, there's a way in which that quote that you read at the beginning, Karen, about empathy isn't just something that happens to us, it's a choice we make to extend ourselves or pay attention. Like that also speaks to a sort of collaborative process where it's not just like you in a flash of light maybe know what somebody else is thinking or feeling. It has to be this kind of messy process of experiment, and maybe you get it wrong, but maybe you're talking about it and listening to the ways you might have gotten it wrong. But it's, again, it's like that, the strange material of sort of being or consciousness or seeing as getting passed and back and forth between two people, like a kind of a talisman or a stone or something like that. I don't know if that, I mean, I would be so curious, like kind of how you, Samara, in a way, like feel like whether there are ways in which you feel like the installation or the exhibition became something that it couldn't have been otherwise by virtue of some of the kind of glitches or disruptions or surprises along the way, or ways that you felt like it became something that it couldn't have been otherwise because of the other people who ended up being part of the process of making it.
Yeah, good question. I kind of feel like I don't know, to be honest. I think all of it is in there, but I think that I'm mostly an intuitive person and kind of can't really tell even what happened until I'm totally outside of it. So I'm sure that it is that way, but I don't even know how I could break it down right now. I know that we made a lot of decisions together, which is unusual in some ways, where like we decided to hone down the piece many times. Like it was originally many different vignettes and then ended up being this one strong kind of graceful move or something. But I don't know, it's interesting, and this is not answering your question, but just as a side note, for me, the idea of empathy has been so much wrapped up in this idea that for me, I feel like I've always been a sponge. And it's taken me a long time in my life to realize that this is even true. But that like I've been this observer sponge who's like over empathizing with everybody rather than having sympathy, which keeps you separated from other people and able to help. But with empathy, it's like if someone's in a bad mood, and you can correct me because I don't know if this is the right definition really, but if someone's in a bad mood around you, you'll start to completely like, you will internalize that totally and feel those feelings like yourself, even though they're a separate person. And so for me, or if they're really happy or whatever it is, it's like not having a very good border between you and somebody else, which can be so important for understanding other people's point of views, but can also be kind of toxic for actually being helpful to them. So it's something I've thought about it a lot and struggled with, but it's interesting to think of it in more of a universal way. Yeah, just want to make that side note. But I don't really know. I mean, I'm sure, I hope that doesn't sound offensive to anyone at the studio because I'm so thankful to everyone there. But Abby probably has more perspective on the piece than I do at this point.
I don't think that was offensive. I think it just kind of brings into the nuance of what you were saying, Leslie. Like it's hard to know how big it got because you were so a part of every single step. And so you're in it, you're in there, it's all in that installation, and it's kind of blurring the lines it's not like you did this and the studio did this. It was like this kind of billowing out of ideas and objects and materials. I do want to quickly segue to one thing that did happen that had to change and is probably the result of kind of the studio stepping in, is the blanket. Originally, this installation was going to be almost full. At least the railing was going to have what is a material called thermochromic ink, which for me, I always call hypercolor. Like it changes color when you touch it, because you really wanted the installation to convey this idea of presence, of people without people, of just how we contribute to a sense of the world. And then, of course, quickly, we realized that something that was supposed to be a tender gesture became something that was going to be very dangerous and unprecedented, really. And so the studio and you quickly pivoted to this idea of a blanket. And Abby's here to give us a little demo of what it means to print with thermochromic ink, but also to show off the amazing blanket that they made.
So quick camera shift. So this is the blanket. I'm really excited to show this to you guys. First off, I'm here up in the 6th floor print studio. And I have just some of the ephemera from printing is like the screen that we use to print this. And I just wanted to show you the thermochromic, the ribbons that change color when you touch them. I think it was really important for us to be able to show and kind of show that mark of touch. This blanket, it ties physically and directly to your brother-in-law Samara, and the I think you can chime in about this about the lap blanket that he had. Is that correct?
Yeah, just he had ALS, and it makes you really cold and really hot, and he was paralyzed completely. But I was trying to get him a really nice blanket that, because he always needed one, and that's light, and it also has to do with all that camping, wanting to be outside of society thing too.
Yeah. So yeah, we even though this is, you know, a nice, beautiful artist multiple, we also wanted to reference that camping, and so it's a packable, functional blanket. So the other thing, kind of the very early stages of developing this with Samara, was playing with the thermochromic ink. So I can quickly show you our process for swatching. So I think we started with just playing with layering and talking about different colors and the way it reacts. But here I'm just going to show you what we do here to print swatches. So this is how we do swatches, and this was one of our early tests where we were experimenting with a bunch of our pigments and then layering them with thermochromic ink that changed colors, just to show like the different layering. And here you can get like tertiary colors from the thermochromic, which was really beautiful, and we had so much fun. But you know, yeah, initially we were going to use these in the exhibition in multiple ways, but we had to pivot and do this beautiful blanket.
Samara, is there anything you want to add about the blanket?
Oh, just that it was actually like interesting that that's the idea of collaboration really came together in that blanket. So yeah, I don't really know. I mean, I know, or I guess one thing about the thermochromic ink that does seem important that you already sort of touched on is that that I was interested in so many of these different materials, like materials that flash when you put light on them, and like all these kind of like, the studio probably felt like they were going in hell and back, just trying to do all these experiments about things that I was interested in.
Yeah, we loved it.
And yeah, there's so many that we're not going to talk about tonight, but for the thermochromic ink, the idea was to have it on the railings of the viewing platform, so that when people were there touching it and looking at it, that they would leave their mark for a minute. And then when the pandemic started, it was interesting because there was just such a big shift that happened, where that was like literally a death call or something. It was like, you can't have the area touched and then touched by somebody else. And at this point in it too, we have to remember that we didn't know whether you could get it by like people were saying wash your hands so much because they didn't understand it was mostly respiratory disease. So to me, that's kind of like a summation of what happened in the piece in a lot of ways. Like a lot of things went 180 the other direction. And the blanket is another one. I haven't seen it in person yet, which is like, so, because I'm like the type of person who's like sitting on the floor of my studio making the stuff by hand, and then like I always make everything by hand, or if I need it to be more things, then there's more people involved. But it's like I'm very connected to actually working out my ideas through making the thing. So it's been really like a body disconnected from a mind disconnected from hands to do this whole project. But I mean, I'm super thankful and really happy, and also one last thing I wanted to say, and then I don't think I know what to say after that, is that this process of, or this idea of empathy for me has a lot to do with the fact that having all you guys there at the Fabric Workshop, being able to kind of internalize, and you, Leslie, in this situation, like having other people internalize the piece and then come back with their own perspective on what it is has been really intense, and really it's been pretty incredible, actually, because I think it's just been very more true than it would be if we were all trying to be professionals, not during the pandemic. And it's been really meaningful to me. So that I think is something I just wanted to point out.
Well, on behalf of the people that have experienced it both in person and virtually, I just want to thank you for leaving us with this space to ponder the year that we had, for the one that we're facing. It is so resonant and has really provided that impossible space to put these impossible feelings. And so I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for going with us on this journey into uncharted territories for all of us. So I want to thank Abby for going along with her, and all the Fabric Workshop colleagues who went and, as you said, internalized and responded. It was such a great, incredible quest. And for Leslie for jumping in and experiencing it and seeing things that, again, we're seeing more and more information and more ideas that we need to, like, I can't wait to go back again and see it and to think about what you said about the installation. So I appreciate all this talk, all these thoughts and ideas. I also want to spend the last 5 minutes opening it up to the people in the Zoom room with us. If there are questions that you'd like to put in the chat, or if you'd like to just, I think, unmute yourself, I think that's okay. I hope I'm not over speaking or speaking incorrectly, but if you'd like to just ask, or if we'd like to ask each other questions, we have 5 minutes just to kind of open it up. So please do that.
I'm the most shy person here, and I never want to ask a question, but you guys should do it. It's fine. I'm happy everyone's here too. Thank you guys for being here.
Leslie, do you get asked a lot about your definition of empathy? Like, I feel like this year was a big year for empathy and how it's evolved, and it's such an interesting topic to unpack. And I was thinking about it in terms of space. You know, we're all home now, and I guess I just wanted to know that in case I'm just prompting people to ask any question. I have sillier questions, but okay, good. Yvonne has a question, but how, in terms of space, where does empathy show up now that we're isolated? That's one of my questions.
Yeah, well, I do have some thoughts, and maybe we'll hear Yvonne's question, and then maybe I can,
Right.
we'll see who we can speak to everything, hopefully.
Right.
I just wanted to ask if by giving up, Tamara, your sense of giving up on collaboration, did that somehow actually open you up to collaboration?
No, I think I just had come to a point where I felt like I didn't know how to do it. And then luckily, and kind of, yeah, it was just I do think that you have to be, I was open to, I could actually recognize that what I was experiencing talking to Abby was maybe a new pathway to being more open myself. I mean, I think that I'm trying to think of how to answer really simply. All my work in the past is like, it's sort of all about controlling everything to make it be the thing I want it to be. And it had to be very controlled on all different levels, even though it was like something that maybe looks like a mess. It's like really over managed to make it come out exactly how I wanted it to be. And so when I say I was giving up on collaboration, I was just feeling like it was difficult for me as a person to figure out how I fit into that or how I could do that. So then, yeah, I don't know exactly. Bad answer, but I think I've been trying to learn. And also one thing I really learned through this process is that the idea of experimentation, like just finding a material, getting it, and then trying all these tests with it and trying to do things is like opposite of a perfectionist's way of doing things. And I really needed that lesson because I am or have been in the past really self-critical, and like if something wasn't going to be perfect, I wasn't going to do it. So just that kind of rolling process of experimenting with things has definitely helped. Like even the last couple of months when I've been trying to work on new work, just trying to try things instead of feeling like making an assumption about anything beforehand. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, I think just to quickly jump off of what you were saying, Samara, because there was so much in what you just said that was interesting to me, like the idea of sort of, it almost summoned that idea of like the Buddhist idea of beginner's mind, or like that maybe one way in which like giving up on the possibility of something, especially if it's not so much like you're pushing it away, but sort of just admitting like, I have to kind of build this thing almost from the ground up, or figure out what collaboration might look like for me from the ground up. Like, I think there's something about erasing the assumption of being able to do something that can like open us up to new ways of doing things. And I don't know, through this whole conversation about disruption and various forms of like stability being taken away, I've been thinking about this picture book that I was reading a lot with my daughter, who's 3, during the pandemic. I'm sure many of you know it, but it's a picture book, The Polar Express. And the way that it opens is this little boy who's waiting on Christmas Eve for the sound of Santa Claus's sleigh, and he keeps waiting for the sound of bells. But what he hears instead is the sound of a train, like a mechanical sound, which is of course this amazing train that's full of like hot chocolate and nougat, and it's headed to the North Pole. Like, it's pretty awesome what shows up. But there feels to me like something really true about that idea of like, you're waiting for bells, but what arrives is the sound of a train instead. And it's like you can only hear the train if you're not assuming that it has to be a bell, you know? And it just feels like so much of the story of this installation is like, maybe you were listening for a certain bell or seeking a certain bell, but then you like heard another train, you heard another sound instead and followed that, or you guys did some of that work together. And I feel like that is part of what disruption can invite, is kind of like to stay listening for things that you couldn't have even quite imagined, you know?
Yeah, I really agree. Or just the idea of being open to what the other thing is, even able to recognize that something is good. I mean, it happens to all of us in all of our lives all the time. I think just this kind of idea of you have an idea of what you want to happen, and then somebody walks into the room who's not supposed to be the person that you're putting all that into, but they say something different, and then your whole life or your whole direction goes that way. And the only way that that can happen is if you recognize that it's happening and go with it. So I do think this idea of letting go has been pretty important during this time, but I'm not saying, I'm definitely no expert at it. I'm just like going crazy like everyone, but I do think it's a good loss or kind of thing to think about as like a escape route and a good one.
And thank you so much, everyone.
I just want to thank you guys for all your really intense thoughts and showing up in this weird way. And I'm kind of like, I guess I'm a little bit of a Luddite, I think is I've been having a really hard time like getting myself to be involved in this way. So I know it's like, I really appreciate everyone who decided to come here, and that you, Leslie, like decided to do this without even knowing me or not even seeing the piece, and that you have such amazing insights, and Abby for showing up to do this, even though it's weird, and showing us all that stuff. And anyway, and Karen, of course, for making me feel comfortable in this craziness. Because I think I've called you so many times being like, I'm not sure if I want to do this. I'm not sure if I can handle being on, like, anyway.
We're grateful that you decided against that. We're glad that you're here.
I just wanted to echo that thanks for all of our speakers. For Samara, thank you so much just for this amazing piece for Upstairs at Steve's, which will be up until February 21st. So if you're in town, you can register to safely see it in our galleries. And thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, Abby. Thank you so much, Leslie, for joining us. And thank you so much, everyone in the audience, for listening. I think that we've all learned quite a lot tonight, just about ourselves and each other. And I'm grateful for that. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you at future events and at FWM.